Everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. Come and eat. Listen diligently to me.
Well, shalom and welcome again to Waters in the Wilderness, teaching ministry of Hoshana, Rabbah, Biblical Discipleship Resources. Today, we are going to ask the question and attempt to answer it. Why celebrate the 7 biblical feasts of Yehovah? If you had to sum up the entire message of the Bible in one word, what would that word be? If you were to sum up the entire message of the Bible in one word, what would that be? Some would say Yeshua, some would say love, some would say God, or whatever. I don't know. There's a lot of good possible answers. But I would propose that one word that would sum up the message of the Bible would be the word reconciliation. The word reconciliation is a word which means to restore to friendship or harmony, or to settle or resolve a quarrel, or to make consistent that which is incongruous. And certainly the love of God, the message of Yeshua, the gospel message, all these things fit into that. But why would I choose the word reconciliation? And I don't think there's one answer to this question, but for the sake of this discussion, let's look in the terms of the word reconciliation. Elohim created humans, Adam and Eve, the first humans on this earth, and he had a close relationship with them when he put them in the Garden of Eden. However, when human beings chose to listen to the lies of the serpent at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they chose at that point to rebel against Elohim. And they chose a path of separation from Elohim, from their Father who had created them. When they listened to the enemy and they chose to disobey Yehovah Elohim, this was sin. They went against his word and they became rebellious. And sin or rebellion is what causes, the results of that is man is separated from a holy, a righteous, a sinless Elohim. And he's totally righteous and he's totally loving. And this sin caused man to be separated, and this relationship was broken off. This was called the fall of man. Now, since that time, if man had never sinned, then maybe the rest of the Bible would never have had to be written. I don't know, but it's possible. Because from that point on, the rest of the Bible is about Elohim working to restore right relationship, or reconciling himself, or I should say reconciling man to himself. It's man coming back into relationship with Elohim, or reconciling himself to Elohim, not Elohim reconciling himself to man. Man is the one that broke it off, the relationship, and now man has to come back into relationship with Elohim. And the Bible is really the story of that. The seven biblical feasts of Yehovah, as revealed in the Torah, are prophetically represent the steps that man must take to be reconciled to the Father. Remember, the title of this subject is, or this teaching today is, why celebrate the 7 biblical feasts? And this is something that's foreign to most people in the church world. They maybe heard about the feasts, but they don't do them, and they know very little about them. It's not taught. So why celebrate the feasts? First of all, the feasts are the 7 steps that Elohim has laid out for man to be reconciled to himself. Within the 7 feasts are the complete plan of salvation, or the plan of redemption that Elohim has laid out. It's an easy to understand 7-step plan that even my children can understand. You know, Yeshua said, except you become like a child, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. So the gospel message, the plan of salvation, or the plan of redemption needs to be simple. Now, in this teaching, I'm not going to talk about the individual feasts and the plan of salvation in the feasts. That's going to be the next teaching that we do. So you'll have to stay tuned for that one. However, in the meantime, I'm going to talk about why we need to celebrate the feasts. So I'm just laying out kind of the overview paradigm of this. So even a child can understand the 7 steps of the plan of salvation and the truths that are contained therein. And these truths can be expanded and unfolded, and like a flower, like a bud of a flower, like a rosebud, and it opens up and become a beautiful flower. These feasts, when opened up like a beautiful flower, eventually these steps of salvation include the entire Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, the whole plan of salvation, from Genesis, from the fall of man, all the way to the end of the book of Revelation, with paradise restored and the Garden of Eden, if you will, called the New Jerusalem. Now, this message of redemption from Genesis to Revelation is really a deep message. It's a simple message that a child can understand, but there are depths and widths and heights and breadths that literally boggle the mind, that are staggering and rich beyond belief. You see, the biblical feasts are literally a skeletal structure upon which the truths of the Bible hang. The entire gospel message, the entire message of the Bible hang on the skeletal structure of the feasts. The feasts are all contained in the layout of the tabernacle of Moses. That's another discussion. It all points to Yeshua and all that he did. It's all works together. But just to kind of give you a little bit of extra here to show you how large of a subject it is. But as we discuss this, it will begin to unfold a little bit for you, hopefully. So the feasts are like a skeletal structure. You know, each of us has a skeleton. And our body, kind of like a clothes hanger, you hang up a clothes hanger and you have a garment, a shirt or a coat that hangs on there. And if you take the clothes hanger out, this article of clothing just kind of falls into a shapeless pile on the floor. Well, if we didn't have a skeletal structure, we would be looking more like probably like a jellyfish, a blob. But we have a skeletal structure in our bodies. It's the same thing. The plan of salvation is laid out in these feasts are like a skeletal structure that give form and shape and movement and comprehension and dimension to the plan of salvation. There are literal points along the way that we can relate to and help us to understand where we're at in that process and where we need to go and where we've come from. In fact, the feast days explain. Within the feast days, they explain the concept of redemption, sanctification, salvation, the blood atonement, the glorification of man, end-time eschatology, the history of Israel, the entire gospel message, the covenants of Elohim that he makes with human beings, the marriage of the Lamb of Elohim, the bride of Messiah, the entire message of the gospel. Literally, the feasts are like a container that hold all of this together. And this message is contained in that container called the 7 feasts of Elohim. Now, I really believe that without a deep walking it out comprehension of Yehovah's feast, and I say walking it out, Because how many of you know, for example, you can understand how an automobile engine works by reading it in a book, and you can maybe study mechanics and all that, but until you actually tear an engine apart, until you actually understand how everything works together, you really don't understand it. Or maybe you can be a doctor and you can understand, or be learning to be a doctor, a surgeon, and watch videos and watch the professor, and maybe watch other surgeons who are operating on cadavers or whatever. But until you actually get your hands on the scalpel and actually get in there and start to work with the organs and do that, that's called internship, where they actually work with doctors learning to do this. It's a hands-on thing before you become a full-fledged medical doctor with his own practice. Well, the same thing with the feasts. You can have a head knowledge of it, but when you are actually walking them out, when you are actually doing them, that's really when the revelation, the deeper revelation comes. We learn by doing. That's the things that you do in your life, that's what really sticks in your mind, as opposed to what you've just read out of a book or maybe watched somebody else do. But when you actually do it yourself, the revelation comes. You've walked in somebody else's moccasins, if you will. You understand that. It's the same with the feasts. So I believe that to not understand the feast is to miss some key elements of truth that pertain, biblical truth that pertain to Yehovah's plan of salvation. For example, there's really, speaking about end-time events, you really cannot comprehend fully the second coming of Yeshua, all the events associated with that, including the Great Tribulation, the wrath of God, the resurrection of the righteous, the marriage of the Lamb, the millennium, the New Jerusalem, unless you really understand the feasts. You can have an understanding, but not a full understanding. It's going to be a disjointed understanding. I'm sorry. That's just the way it is. I mean, with all due respect to the Bible teachers out there and all the PhDs and all the pastors, if you don't understand the skeletal structure, if you don't understand the foundation, you're not going to have a full understanding of things. In fact, the feasts, in a sense, are the foundation of the building. The foundation can exist without the building, but the building can't exist without the foundation. You throw the foundation away, and your building is going to be kind of rickety. It may not even stand, or it's going to be unstable. And I'd say that much of Christian theology is kind of unstable. We need to get back to the foundations. To eliminate the skeletal structure, like I said before, you're going to have kind of a blob, and it's going to be lacking some of the definition that a skeletal structure will give to it. Now, at Mount Sinai, Elohim gave Israel, the children of Israel, his 10 commandments in Exodus chapter 20 and subsequent chapters. Now, the 10 commandments are the cornerstone of all of the laws of God. There are 613 commandments, Torah commandments in the Torah, Genesis to Deuteronomy. And these 10 are the cornerstone, because in Jewish thought and in biblical thought, each of these commandments can be expanded out to encompass all the 613. Let me give you some examples. There are all kinds of commandments in the Bible about stealing. Kidnapping is a form of stealing. You're stealing somebody away from, taking somebody, stealing them, basically. And that all goes back to the basic commandment of thou shalt not steal. The murder. Murder, there's many ways to murder somebody. And we learn in the Bible you can also murder with your mouth. Commit adultery. Adultery, the relationship between a husband and wife in a marriage, is the foundation. But there's all kinds of sexual sins, including wrong thoughts of lust, all come under the heading or the moniker of adultery. Same thing with the Sabbath. The seventh day Sabbath is revealed in the Ten Commandments. But the Bible speaks about the Sabbaths. And out of that comes not only the seventh day Sabbath, which is the foundation, but you have the land Sabbath. You have every 7 years, a sabbatical year. And you also have Elohim's holy day or festival Sabbaths. So all of them can be expanded out of the cornerstone of the Ten Commandments. Now, in Exodus 31:13, Elohim says the following. Speaking to the children of Israel through Moses, he says, "Speak thou also unto the children of Israel, saying, Verily, my Sabbaths," plural, "my Sabbaths you shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am Yehovah, that doth sanctify you," or set you aside as a holy people. He said, "My Sabbaths," plural. The seventh day Sabbath is one type of Sabbath. But the Sabbaths, plural, is referring to the high holy day Sabbaths, or the other Sabbaths that are laid out in addition to the weekly Sabbath in Leviticus 23 and elsewhere in the Scriptures. And in many places, Yehovah speaks about the Sabbaths of the Lord. "My Sabbaths you have profaned or polluted, my Sabbaths you shall do." Because they were days of rest. The feast days are days of rest when you focus on Elohim and you do not go to your job, you do not do your work. That's why they're called Sabbaths. There are days where you came together for a Mikra Kodesh or a holy convocation, and you they were Moedim, times of divine appointment when you came together to meet with Elohim in this sanctified place. And the Sabbaths were so important that Yehovah used them as a sign of the Mosaic or Hebraic covenant, or a Mosaic or Sinaitic covenant between him and Elohim. I'm wearing like a wedding ring. This is a sign of my covenant with my wife, my marriage covenant. Well, the Sabbaths were like a wedding ring or like a covenant with Elohim. It was so important in the relationship between Yehovah and his people that he made the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath, which we do every Shabbat, every seventh day of every week, and also the biblical festivals. These were like the foundation stones of the relationship with Elohim. And often, as we've noted before, the Sabbath is one of the first things that people have a hard time with coming back. It's one of the first things that people leave when they turn away from Elohim's truth, and it's one of the hardest things, that and the festivals, to come back to. But these are one of the first things that human beings come back to when they come back, Christians or believers, back to the Hebrew roots of the Christian faith. They come to an understanding of the Sabbath and the feasts. So these are very foundational, fundamental principles. Now, this gives you a little bit of background about the feasts. Let's ask the question, why should we study or celebrate the biblical feasts? Let's answer this question specifically. Now, originally I had 7 points, 7 reasons. 7's a good number. It's a number of perfection in the Bible, completeness. And but I was sitting down reviewing my notes the other day before giving this teaching, and I began to think of some other ones. And so I'm up to 11 now. So there goes the seven, kind of the perfect number. I'm up to 11, and I probably will add some more, and you could probably think of some more. But these are just a few examples that I've come up with that I think really give us an example of why, give us a reason why we should celebrate the biblical feasts. And this isn't in any particular order of importance. I've just simply listed them here as they came to me. Number 1, why we should study and celebrate the biblical feasts. Number 1, the feasts are a prophetic shadow picture of things to come. When they were given to ancient Israel, they pointed forward to future events that would occur to the nation of Israel. The spring feasts, which are Passover, unleavened bread, and Pentecost, the spring feasts point forward to future events that would occur to the nation of Israel. The spring feast point specifically to events surrounding the first coming of Yeshua, back 2,000 years ago. And the fall feasts, that would be trumpets, atonement, tabernacles, and the 8th day, point primarily to events that relate to the second coming of Yeshua. Things which have not happened yet. So this idea, let me just tangentially say this idea that you've heard in the church system that says, well, Jesus came to fulfill all the commandments, and so therefore we don't have to do them. He hasn't fulfilled them all yet. That's in Matthew 5:17. He said, think not that I come to destroy the commandments. I didn't come to destroy them. I came to fulfill them. He has not fulfilled everything yet. The fall feast days point to his second coming, to his judging the earth, the wrath upon the earth, destroying, those things that are opposed to him, to his establishing his kingdom on this earth and marrying his bride, and then eventually living forever in the New Jerusalem. That hasn't happened yet. So those who say that he has already fulfilled this, in that we don't have to do them, quite frankly, are ignorant. They do not understand either the meaning of Yeshua's words, or they don't understand much. Basically, these are traditions of men by which the word of Elohim has been made of none effect. And we're to come out of Babylon, come out of her, my people. Babylon being a spiritual Babylon, being a mixture, religious systems that are a mixture of truth and error, feeding from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There's good in Babylon. There's good in the church system. But we've got to come out of those things that are wrong, that we've been taught. I don't care how many people believe it. I don't care how long they've been teaching it. If it doesn't line up with this, it's got to go. It's that simple. So the feasts are a prophetic shadow picture of things to come. Let me turn real quickly here to Colossians 2:16 through 17. And here we go. He says here, Paul says, let no one judge you in food or in drink or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbath. So in other words, listen, don't let people judge you about these things. He's not saying don't do them. He says don't let people judge you, especially people who are outside the body of Yeshua who don't have a clue. They may think you're strange. They may think you strange that you're not doing Christmas and Easter and those things. And they think you're Judaizing or whatever by keeping the feasts, celebrating the feasts. He says, don't let them judge you. What do they know? They probably don't even know their Bibles. So are you going to let somebody judge you who doesn't know their Bible about what you should and shouldn't do? No. And then he goes on in verse 17. These feasts, these new moons and Sabbaths are a shadow of things to come. But the substance is of Messiah. So what I read from that is they portend or point toward things that are going to happen in the future. And all of it points to Yeshua and revolves around Yeshua. In our next teaching on the plan of salvation in the feast, we will understand that a little bit more fully, how it all revolves around Yeshua, the Messiah. So the feasts are a shadow picture of things to come. Point number 2, all the feasts point to Yeshua. The name Yeshua means salvation. It's a Hebrew name. His name was Yeshua, not Jesus. Yeshua is what his mother called him. Yeshua. Get used to it. You're not going to be calling him Jesus or King Jesus in the kingdom. That's not his name. Now, he understands who you're talking about because he reads the heart. But his name is Yeshua. My name is Nathan, not Bob or Jack. It's Nathan, or Natan is my Hebrew way to say it. So we got to get these things right. So his name is Yeshua, and that's a Hebrew word that means salvation. And all of the biblical feast days, they all point to the various steps of the path of salvation that believers find themselves on. Remember, we're answering the question, why study and celebrate the biblical feasts? Well, because they tell you what the steps of salvation are. That there's more steps to salvation than just saying the sinner's prayer and then signing a dotted line and becoming a member of a church and then going to church every week. and then standing on the street corner waiting for the rapture bus to come and take you to heaven. There's more to it than that. And it's laid out in the scriptures, in the 7 steps of the 7 steps of the salvation as revealed in the feasts. Point number 3, why study and celebrate the biblical feasts? Many of the feast days point back to historical events that occurred in Israel's history from which we can learn lessons and which are representative of our own spiritual journey. You know, it says in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 11, that the things that happened in ancient Israel happened for our learning and our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world have come. They're there for a reason. They're to help us. We can look back at ancient Israel and we can, if we're honest, see ourselves in that, see our carnal man. And again, we'll get into the steps that they went through when they came out of Egypt and how that's a picture of us coming to salvation and leaving the old man and an old sinful man back in Egypt and hearing the call of Elohim and going through the Red Sea, which is a picture of baptism, and coming into the wilderness and receiving his instructions at the Mount Sinai, the Torah, and on our way toward the promised land, which is a picture of the kingdom of Elohim. All of this is representative. So the children of Israel walked these things out to help us to understand. It's kind of us like looking ourselves in the mirror. We can see ourselves. And not only can we see where we've come from, but the feast will show us what our future is. It's our past history because we are redeemed Israelites, because we're under the blood of Yeshua, and we're the one new man grafted into the olive tree. So we are Israelites. That's part of our heritage. But to understand, to appreciate our inheritance, our destiny, we've got to understand our heritage. So the feast days help tie all this together, to help us to understand our past, present, and future. So we're not just a people group floating around out here like, I guess we started on the day of Pentecost, and when I die I'm going to go to heaven and sit on a cloud and play a harp and I'll have a halo, and I guess I'm going to be doing that forever. And I'll maybe sprout some wings. I don't know what people are thinking, but these are the stereotypes that we see and hear about. Okay, number 4. Why study and celebrate the biblical feast? The scriptures call the biblical feast appointed times. They're called moedim, or appointed times that the people of Yehovah are commanded. Yehovah commands these people to observe. This is not an option. He commanded his people. And we are Israelites. And these are times when he says he would meet with his people. Go read Leviticus 23, verse 1 through 2, and again in verse 4. It is at these festivals or commanded assemblies that Yehovah teaches his people about his wonderful plan of salvation and through Yeshua the Messiah. Number 5. The feasts, the biblical feasts, they're in the Bible, and the whole Bible is the inspired word of Elohim. 2 Timothy 3:16. Look, it's in the Bible. If it's in the Bible, it's for us. We need to study it. We need to know about it. Literally, the feasts are from Genesis to Revelation. They're throughout the entire Bible, if you know where to look and how to look for them and understand the language. Number 6, the feasts are set forth the pattern of heavenly things on the earth. There's a number of scriptures in Hebrews and Exodus, Numbers, Ezekiel. I'll put this up on the video, and then I'll have a study guide that goes with it so that you can reference these scriptures. But we know that the feasts are patterns of spiritual realities. We know that there was Elohim instructed Moses and the Israelites to build a physical tabernacle, but we know there's a spiritual tabernacle in heaven. We know, I think it's in the book of Romans, it says that the physical things on earth are patterned after the spiritual things. We can learn a lot about the physical things by looking at the spiritual things. When Moses built the tabernacle, he got the pattern from Elohim up at Mount Sinai, and he brought it down. And the book of Revelation talks about the temple in heaven. And the feasts all relate to this. They all are indivisible. with regard to this plan of salvation and the tabernacle and the things in heaven. I wish we had time to expand on that, but we don't. Number 7, why study and celebrate the biblical feasts? We as physical beings need physical means and methods to help us to understand spiritual things. Yehovah gave us the natural to help us to understand the supernatural. Look, we need to walk things out to help us to understand spiritual stuff. Some of these spiritual truths are just really out there. It stretches the mind. How do we really understand the incarnation? How do we really comprehend the fact that Elohim sent his son to die for our sins? He became flesh and he died for our sins and he was resurrected. I can't comprehend this. How do we understand how his blood could cover my sins and the sins of the world? I mean, I understand it theoretically, but it's hard for me to comprehend. I can't even understand eternity. There's a lot of spiritual things in the Bible we can't really understand, but we can understand them more fully if we will walk them out. And the feasts help us to do that and give us insights into the spiritual realm. Let me give you a passage here, 1 Corinthians 2, 9 through 13. But it is written, eye has not seen nor ear heard, nor has entered into the heart of man the things which Elohim has prepared for those who love him. But as Elohim has revealed them to us through his Spirit, for the Spirit searches all things, yes, the deep things of Elohim. For what man knoweth the things of man except the spirit of man which is in him? Even so no one knows the things of Elohim except the Spirit of Elohim. Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from Elohim, that we might know the things that have been freely given to us by Elohim. These things we also speak not in the words which man's wisdom teaches, but which the Holy Spirit teaches, comparing spiritual things with spiritual things. So there is revelation, there's truth at a spiritual level. And we want to try to understand these things, and the feasts help us to do that. Number 8, why celebrate and study the feasts? Yeshua and the apostles and the early believers celebrated the biblical feasts. The apostles walked as Yeshua walked and instructed us to do the same. 1 Corinthians 11:1, Paul says, be ye imitators as I am of Yeshua the Messiah. In 1 John 2, 3 through 6, let me read this passage. This is an important one. Well, they're all important, but this is especially. He says, by this we know that we know him if we keep his commandments. You want to know him? Then keep his commandments. Yeshua said, if you love me, keep my commandments. What are his commandments? He spells it out. He spells it out in Luke. I think it's chapter 18. I'm not sure if that's the wrong one. I'll get it corrected on the video. But he says he connects the Greek word entole, which means commandments, with the Torah commandments when he's talking to I think it's the rich young ruler there. So the commandments of Elohim of Yeshua are his Torah commandments. If you want to know him, keep his commandments. That's how we love him, and that's how we love one another. Love your neighbor as yourself, and Elohim with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, which is the summation of the laws of Moses. And his feast days are part of those commandments. Continuing in 1 John 2, verse 4, he who says, I know him, and does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. Whoever keeps his word, truly the love of God is perfected in him. By this we know that we are in him. And he who says he abides in him ought himself also to walk just as he, that's Yeshua, walked. And Yeshua kept the Torah. Yeshua kept the Sabbath. Yeshua kept the feasts. And he didn't do them so that we wouldn't have to do them any more than Yeshua didn't murder, so that now we are free to go out and murder. Any more than Yeshua did not go out and have sex outside of marriage, any more than we are free to have sex outside of marriage. And Yeshua did not fulfill or keep thou shalt not steal, so now we can go out and do that. And he also didn't keep the Sabbath, so that now we are free to go out and violate the Sabbath. But that's exactly what the church teaches. That's illogical. In Elohim's word, 2 plus 2 equals 4. In the doctrines of men, by which the word of Elohim is made of none effect, 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4. It'll equal 5, 14, 24, or 44, but it doesn't equal 4. That's why we need to lose the doctrines of men that contradict the word of Elohim. And I don't care how clever the arguments are, how well ensconced they are into human theological tradition, or how long they've been doing it, or how many people follow it. It can be millions or billions. The truth is still the truth. God's word will stand, and we will be judged by it. And so it's very important that we line our lives up with it. Okay. Now, number 9, the biblical feast will be celebrated during the millennium. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Number 10, Yeshua said that if you love him, you'll be keeping his commandments. John 14:15. Elsewhere, Yeshua equated the commandments with the Torah. Luke 18, verse 20. I just mentioned that. I forgot I had that point in there. It was in Luke 18, it's verse 20, of which the biblical feasts are a part. And finally, if you want to know Yehovah, you will be keeping his Torah commandments, of which the feasts are a part. That's 1 John 2, 3 through 6. I got ahead of myself and I already quoted that one. So there you go. Now, let's ask the next question. Actually, it's not a question. Let's explore the next point. The feasts of Elohim were ordained at the creation. It wasn't Moses that came up with them. It wasn't the Jewish people that came up with them. It was Yehovah Elohim who gave them to the Israelites. I know in the Gospels, in a few places, are called the Jews' feasts. That's another discussion, and there's a reason for that. But they came from Elohim. They were given to the children of Israel out by the audible voice of Elohim to Moses and the children of Israel, and they came from heaven. In fact, the Sabbath predates the law of Moses. I mean, Moses giving the children of Israel the commandments. It goes clear back to the Genesis chapter 2, the creation on the seventh day. Passover, the children of Israel kept the first Passover and unleavened bread in Egypt as they were coming out of Egypt. Again, that was almost 2 months before Mount Sinai. But let's all go all the way back to Genesis 1, verse 14. Genesis 1:14. Let me read this to you. And Elohim said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs, and for seasons, and for days, and for years." So here we see that the astral bodies, the planets, and the sun have something to do with seasons, and they're like a gigantic timepiece, like a big clock. And they are there to keep time, and something relating to seasons here. Now the word for signs, in other words, the sun and the moon and the planets are to be signs. The word signs is the Hebrew word ot, O-W-T, and it means a distinguishing mark, a banner, remembrance, a proof, an omen, a warning, a token, an ensign, or a miracle. So this was a visible sign that was clearly visible for all to see. You can see the moon, you can see the planets, you can see the sun. Now, the heavenly bodies were created as signs or signals of something. Of what? Well, we have the word seasons used in Genesis 1:14 too, and that's the word moed. Plural, it's moedim. So in this case, it would be moedim for seasons. And it literally means a congregation, a feast, a season, appointed time, assembly. We could reread this verse to mean, and Elohim said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for moedim, or festivals, and for days and for years." What festivals is he talking about? Well, I'll tell you what he's not talking about. Christmas, Easter, Halloween, Thanksgiving, the 4th of July, Ramadan, Purim, or even Hanukkah. He's talking about the biblical feasts that we find all laid out in Leviticus 23 and many other places in the scriptures. Let me prove my point here. If we go to Leviticus 23 verse 4, Leviticus 23 verse 4, you need to know Leviticus 23 because it lists all the feasts there, all in order. If you go to Leviticus 23 verse 4, you find this statement. These are the feasts, these are the Moedim of Yehovah. These are the feasts of Yehovah, even holy convocations, Mikra Kodesh, or Mikrai Kodesh, which you shall proclaim in their seasons. The Moedim in their seasons. So the Moedim and seasons are synonymous. And the festivals belong to the seasons. I'd like to propose to you that the seasons, or the biblical festivals, the plan of redemption, pre-existed the creation. Because Elohim knew that man was going to fall and sin, and he'd need a plan to redeem man. He wasn't caught sitting on his thumbs. He wasn't caught when man sinned at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, wringing his hands, what am I going to do now? He knew what was going to happen. He set it all up. And he had a plan in purpose, in place. Hallelujah. He had a plan in place. And he had already created the earth with its seasons, because, as we will learn later in future teachings, the 7 feast days correspond perfectly with the 4 seasons. The first feast day, Passover, is in the spring of the year, which in the Bible is the beginning of the year, is the new year. Just as things are coming alive after a long, cold, dead winter, and the birds are starting to sing, and the leaves are coming on the trees, and the flowers are beginning to bloom, that's when it's new life, rebirth. That's a picture of spiritual rebirth of each human being. When they're coming into the spring of their life, out of the deadness of their human, carnal, flesh nature in spiritual Egypt where they've come from. You see, and then you go through the seasons, and you come to the harvest time in the fall, when the fall feasts take place, and that's speaking of a great spiritual harvest that's going to take place at the end of the age, at the second coming of Yeshua. The seasons are crying forth and declaring the plan of salvation. This plan of salvation came first, and the creator of the universe sculpted and molded the seasons, or the seasons around his plan of salvation. Yes, the heavens declare the glory of Elohim, as Psalm 19 says, in more ways than you and I can possibly imagine. And we'll talk more about that in future teachings. Hallelujah. Does that get you excited? Do you realize it? Does that make you worship Elohim and realize that he's in charge and that he is omniscient and all-powerful and he set everything up and men are without excuse? It's all around us. And it's our job to proclaim it and to share this message with as many people as possible. And when you come to realize this truth, it's like, man, stuff just kind of starts to take off in your understanding. And it hopefully makes you want to worship the Lord. And Yeshua is the creator of it all. He's Elohim, the Father, used Yeshua to create everything. And then Yeshua himself stepped into his creation to become the Redeemer and to save man. My mind boggles to think about it. Yeshua created all things. Go read Colossians 2 and Hebrews 11 verse 1, I think it is, or 2. It's the first couple verses of Hebrews 11, where Yeshua created everything. The Word created everything. He created everything in the whole universe. And then he stepped into his creation to become the creator, to become the Redeemer. I don't know about you, but my brain just kind of short-circuited right there. but I believe it by faith, and I say, hallelujah, I'll take it. I'll receive it. I mean, that's what life is all about. That's the joy that's been set apart, set in front of us, the hope and the joy. And he wants us to be part of his eternal family forever and ever. Literally, as Paul said, adopted into his family to be with him forever by walking out these steps of the plan of salvation. Now, in quick conclusion, let me just say that the feast days are forever. In Exodus 12, verse 14, we read, "And this day shall be unto you for a memorial, and you shall keep it as a feast to Yehovah throughout your generations. You shall keep it a feast by an ordinance forever." I'd have to go back and look and see which, I think that would be talking about Passover there, if it's in Exodus 12, Passover and unleavened bread. And then in Leviticus 23:14, "It shall be a statute forever throughout your generation and all your dwellings." I'm thinking, again, I don't have it in my notes, but I'm thinking that this is referring to unleavened bread. The Feast of Unleavened Bread. And again, this is just a couple examples, but many places he states that the feasts are forever. And then remember what Yeshua said in Matthew 5:17. "Do not think that 17 through 19, do not think that I come to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For surely I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, not one jot or tittle will by no means pass from the Torah law till all is fulfilled. Whoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teach them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven." The word forever in the Torah is the word olam, and it means everlasting, perpetual, evermore, always, continuous, unending, future, or for eternity. Do you understand what that word means? It's forever. And then Yeshua said, as long as the earth is still here, everything in the Torah is for us. I mean, everything that can be applied. Obviously, some things were fulfilled in him, like the sacrificial system and the Levitical priesthood. It says that in the book of Hebrews. Okay, that we understand that. But I'm talking about his Sabbaths, his feasts, and how you treat your neighbor, the dietary laws, how you love Elohim. Those things are still applicable to us today. So despite anyway, it's forever. It's just forever. It's as long as the earth is still standing. Now, the feasts were ordained and observed in during the apostolic era, the era of the new covenant, or the what we call the time of the testimony of Yeshua during the first century. Acts 18 verses 20 and 21, Paul talks about going to Jerusalem to keep the feast. In this case, he would have been referring to one of the pilgrimage festivals, either Passover, the Days of Unleavened Bread, or Pentecost, or the Feast of Tabernacles. In Acts 20, verse 6, they were keeping the unleavened bread, Feast of Unleavened Bread. In Acts 20, verse 16, they were keeping Pentecost. I mean, they kept Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. The early church in the upper room, or wherever they were at. I mean, they were there on the day of Pentecost. Paul, in 1 Corinthians, verses 5 and 7, he says, let us keep, or celebrate. The word keep in the Greek means celebrate. Let us celebrate, and he's referring to Passover and the days of unleavened bread. Let us keep the feast, not with the old leaven, neither with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. This is a reference to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So he's saying, let us keep it. He didn't say it was done away with, that believers didn't need to keep them anymore. He said, let us. He's talking to both Jews and non-Jews in the book of, in Corinth. We see in Acts 27, verse 9, the Day of Atonement is mentioned. In Acts 21, 24, it's said of Paul, it said that, you are he who walks orderly and keeps the Torah. You keep the Torah. Acts 21, 24, it says of Paul that he walked orderly and keeps the Torah. The commandments to observe the feasts are in the Torah. And Paul, in Acts 21, this is toward the end of his ministry, was still keeping the Torah. And we also see, in conclusion, that in the Messianic age, or the millennium, as it's known, that the biblical feasts will be kept. Zechariah 14, verses 16, 18, and 19 speak about the Feast of Tabernacles, and we believe that that's a prophecy speaking about the millennium. Don't have time to go through all those right now. You can look them up and read them for yourself. Ezekiel 45, 17, the temple of this vision that Ezekiel had of the temple, and many think this is a millennial temple. He talks about the Sabbaths, plural, which include the weekly Sabbath and the annual Sabbath, or the biblical feasts. And he talks about the solemnities, or the Moedim, and also, or the appointed times, verse 9. So that's Ezekiel 45, 17, and check out also verse 9. Ezekiel 45, 21, he talks about Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And in Ezekiel 45, 25, Ezekiel 45 is full of them, he talks about the Feast of Tabernacles. And then in Ezekiel 46, verse 1, Ezekiel mentions the weekly Sabbath. And then in Ezekiel 45, verses 9 and 11, he talks about solemn or appointed times, the Moedim, or the feasts. And, so there again, there covers certainly the pilgrimage festivals of Passover, unleavened bread, and then Pentecost, and then tabernacles. But it probably includes all of them, because loosely they're all referred to as feasts in Leviticus 23, the first several verses there. So there you have several reasons why we should study the feasts and even celebrate them. I hope you will seriously consider this and realize that when you follow the feasts, when you observe them and celebrate them, there are great blessings, great understanding. It's a river of life, spiritual life. It's a tremendous blessing. Just end on this note. It wasn't until the time of Constantine, in the first half of the 4th century, so we're talking about several hundred years after the time of the apostles, basically from 100 AD to 325, so about 225 years, there were still believers in the early Christian church that were doing the feasts. They were certainly doing Passover, because it was very controversial in the early church from the second half of the 2nd century on up about when to do Passover, because there were many that wanted to do it on the first Sunday after the spring equinox, I think is what it was. And they called this Easter. Eventually they called this Easter, or Resurrection Sunday, but it became known as Easter. But there were other early church fathers who said, no, we're going to do Passover. That's what we're supposed to do. Polycarp, actually, who was a disciple of John, says that in his little book in the early part of the 1st century, or 2nd century. So there was this debate. There was this debate among early Christians. It wasn't until, it was called the Quartodeciman controversy. Some of you maybe run across that. Quartodeciman, it's Latin for 4 or 10. 4 in quarto and deciman 10. And it literally means the 14th. Shall we keep Passover on the 14th? Or shall we move it over to Sunday to honor the resurrection of Yeshua and eventually change the name to Easter? And there were those that said, no, we're going to keep Passover. And it wasn't until the time of Constantine. Listen, go read Constantine's letters in Eusebius' Ecclesiastical History. Eusebius was an early church father. He wrote a book called Ecclesiastical History. You can get it online. You can buy it. It's out there. It's available anywhere. And in there, there's letters in that book where Constantine is railing against the Jews. He's hating the Jews. He's going to persecute and he's going to exile. And he's speaking just venomous words against the Jews and against the Sabbath and against the Jewish beliefs. And he demanded, you're gonna make a ruling against the Sabbath, and you're gonna make a ruling to the bishops who were gathered in Nicaea, a ruling against the Passover, and we're going to do it on Easter. And that's when that ruling came down. That's when it became official in the church. 225 years, or maybe a little over 225 years after the death of the last apostle. So don't believe the lie that the early believers did not keep the feasts. I'm talking about in the book in the first century. That is a lie. It's not backed up in the scriptures, and it's not backed up in history of the early church fathers. Anyway, blessings to you. Study and celebrate the feasts. Be blessed, and shalom, and may Elohim bless you.
Come, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. Come and eat. Listen diligently to me, and eat what is good, and let your soul delight itself in abundance